When it comes to rock music, my guest Joel Selvin is one of the best known writers of books and columns on the subject. Joel, good morning and welcome here to WDHA in New Jersey.
Good to be with you, Jim.
Joel's latest book, Drums and Demons, the tragic story of Jim Gordon. And Jim, of course, a legendary drummer and indeed a tragic story. As you're going through the research for this book, Joel, what surprised you most about Jim Gordon? What did you learn?
Uh, how about how common schizophrenia is? Schizophrenia exists in 1 in 100 in the general population. Multiple sclerosis is 1 in 10,000, but 1 in 100, I mean, that's 1% of our country is hearing voices. And of all those diagnosed schizophrenics, only half respond to treatment at all. So it's just a very dangerous, poisonous condition that affects a broad swath of people. And one of the important things about this book is that it is a detailed account of how mental illness can make your life disaster.
If you look back at his life history, though, growing up with an alcoholic father, he had his own battles with alcohol and drugs, and I think that was what they initially diagnosed him at, not as schizophrenic, but it was due to alcohol, and I could see why that would be, Joel, based on his drug consumption alone.
Massive amount of intake. Everybody that was around him commented on his metabolism being able to just absorb alcohol and drugs. But frankly, I think those were the best coping mechanisms he had available to himself at that time. The kind of psychiatric drugs that they were giving him, which he took too, were, sledgehammer kind of drugs. Today we have more surgical approach to pharmaceuticals, but Haldol was an antipsychotic that they gave him. The one of the side effects was making his ribs feel constricted. Can you imagine playing drums in a chemical straitjacket? Well, he did. And yeah, his mother was a longtime member of Alcoholics Anonymous, as was his father, and his mother was also a medical professional, but she was convinced that Jim's problems were only drugs and alcohol. She didn't see this that he was mentally ill, and the psychiatrists that he saw weren't able to properly diagnose him because he was so high functioning. He was making a lot of money. He was incredibly successful in a highly competitive field. So they tended to write him off as like, a depressive or maybe a mood disorder. But he never received proper treatment, and he was tortured by this disease for years and years and years.
One of the things that also comes out in the book, in addition to being, the story of Jim Gordon, it's also kind of the story of that whole Los Angeles music scene in the 60s and 70s that he was such a huge part of. And while I knew he had played on a bunch of different sessions, Joel, I had no idea the amount of different artists that he had played with, from the Beach Boys to the Monkees to Frank Zappa to Carly Simon. Just an amazing roster of artists that he played with.
Jim had an incredible sense of drums as a musical instrument, and he could find a place for himself, a important musical place in many, many people's music. He was Merle Haggard's favorite drummer, and then he played on all those Gary Puckett records, and those Gary Puckett records were huge, 26, 28 session players and one drummer. So yeah, he's all over the catalog of recordings out of Los Angeles in the late 60s. And of course, that was just an explosive time for Southern California. I mean, it's Merle Haggard records, Beach Boys records, Jan and Dean records, Mamas and Papas, Glenn Campbell, Nancy Sinatra, Sonny and Cher. That's Jim on the kit at The Beat Goes On.
It's one of my favorite songs of all time. You note in the book that when Jim Gordon played on a record, he made his presence felt. And I went deep down the Jim Gordon rabbit hole over the weekend with different YouTube clips. And the thing that got me most, Joel, was he reminds me a little bit of, say, a Mark Knopfler or a B.B. King. It's not necessarily what he played, but what he didn't play. Unlike some of his contemporaries, maybe Keith Moon, John Bonham, those kinds of drummers, Ginger Baker, who really made their presence felt on a record, what Jim did to me was kind of lay back. And again, what he didn't play was as important as what he did play.
Well, that's always true of musicians. I mean, jazz guys are well aware of like the space around the music is more important than the music in many ways. But Jim, like I said, was this compositional drummer, and he used his drums as a way to serve the record. I mean, look, like I was in the studio 3 sessions a day, 6 days a week, 3 to 5 songs a session for years. And those sessions, those were all dedicated to one ideal, which was to make hit records. So, collaborating with another 30 or 40 guys that floated in and out of these sessions, they sharpened their skills to a kind of surgical, scientific level. And we're playing on a level that just was unmatched in the rest of the world. I mean, Los Angeles just blew up in that 64 to 69 period as a recording center. Before then, it had been kind of a remote West Coast outpost. And those records that those guys made were the things that drove the entire record industry in those years.
Listening to the way you just described it, and then in reading the book, the line that comes to mind is Joni Mitchell's stoking the star-making machinery behind the popular song, because Jim was right in the thick of it.
That was his job. He was there to make money. He was there to make hit records. It was like a gunslinger kind of mentality, and that was the aesthetic, the ethic, the pride of the session player. That was their job, and they were good at it. That's what they did.
A lot of people, of course, know him, Jim Gordon, from Mad Dogs and Englishmen, Derek Clapton, the Layla sessions. What he did on Layla, I thought was just extraordinary. And that song alone, the way he goes and changes the beat from 1, 2, 3, 4 to just the traditional 2 and 4, just it made the song, and again, without overplaying. I was blown away by his playing on that track and that entire record, as a matter of fact.
You're so perceptive to notice that because, of course, the guitars are so dynamic in that piece. It's really hard to get down to where the drums are. The YouTube, the internet world has a bunch of isolated drum tracks of Jim playing on Layla, and it's truly revelatory how brilliant, how nuanced, how incredibly subtle the drumming is on that. He braids the drum part around those guitar parts, and in doing so is able to propel the whole track. It's really marvelous, and that's Jim's trick. That's Jim's thing. And every record he's on, whether it's You're So Vain by Carly Simon or Sundown by Gordon Lightfoot, he gets into the composition and then prods it along the way it needs to go.
There's another great story in the book of him with a young Tom Petty and a young Mike Campbell on the session for that. Tell our listeners about that, because it's a great story.
The people that were in that room that day still remember it like a car crash they were in. It was just astonishing to all involved. But Tom Petty's band had broken up, and there was not a Heartbreakers yet. So they ran a couple of Tom Petty solo sessions and used session musicians. They brought in Al Cooper to play piano. They brought in Emery Gordy from Emmylou Harris's band to play bass. And then Tom and Mike played guitars. Jim was the drummer. Now, I've seen the union contract, and everybody got scale except Jim. Jim came in at triple scale.
Wow.
But that didn't bother anybody. They were all like, whoa, this is the guy from Layla.
Yeah.
I mean, they were pumped, right? And they cut their first track. They go into the studio. They listen back. And Jim says to the engineer, do you have any room left? Because I could double my drum. And Petty and Campbell looked at each other like they'd never heard of somebody doubling their drums. And you got to imagine, I mean, that's just an incredibly impossible task, because you've got to hit same place on the drums with the same strength at the same time. It's got to match volume, value, timing, because all you do is slip once on the cymbal and it's going to smear the track. All right. He goes out and does it in one take, like a magic trick or something. And these people, I talked to a guy just last week who was there, is going, he just couldn't believe it. But that's Jim. He had a supernatural talent and he was the drums. He didn't play the drums, he was the drums, and the drums were his safe place. He could play drums and his disease went away.
An amazing story. The book called Drums and Demons, The Tragic Story of Jim Gordon. Joel, for WDHA listeners who want to learn more about the book or purchase it, where can they go?
Well, I would hope they would go to their local neighborhood independent bookstore. I would also refer y'all to the Spotify Drums and Demons playlist. If you got a spare afternoon, it's Drums ampersand Demons, and it's about 4.5 hours, and it's everything you could imagine. So there's a rabbit hole for you.
Indeed. And I went deep into that rabbit hole over the weekend. Thank you so
It's
much for your time.
amazing,
The
isn't
book
it?
is wonderful. Oh, it's incredible, the stuff he played on and what he played.
Yeah, no, it's just once you open your eyes to the Jim Gordon thing and start listening to it on record, it just jumps out at you, and you can always tell it's Jim. For instance, on Good Vibrations, he's shares the master track with Hal Blaine. Hal Blaine did most of the Beach Boys records, but the composite master track features Jim on the second verse, on the bridge, and on the outro. And when you listen to the outro of Good Vibrations next time, you'll hear the bubble and the boil, the Jim Gordon undercurrent as he drives that home. It's there isn't a record he played on that he didn't bring himself to.
It's such a sad ending too, but a wonderful read. I highly recommend the book, Drums and Demons, The Tragic Story of Jim Gordon. Joel, thank you for your time this morning and best of luck with the book.
Thanks so much. It really means a lot to me. Jim's something I came to really care about him, and I really felt like that he didn't get any compassion and understanding in his lifetime. And then maybe we'll get him some now.